They said the West was a land of second chances, of dusty trails where a woman could bury the ghosts that followed her eastbound. For 30-year-old Elowen Gray, whose hair was the color of spun silver against the sun, that promise had shimmered like a distant mirage. Yet as her carriage lurched onto the rutted road into Mercy Ridge, a town forgotten by time, her heart throbbed with a hollow ache that felt too familiar. Hope intertwined with dread. Elowen sat rigid on the narrow bench seat, her slender fingers clutching the satchel in her lap as if it were a lifeline. The satchel held her letters, the yellowed pages where she had poured out her dreams, her fears, and the bare facts a stranger needed to know before agreeing to marry. That she had white hair at 30 was something she feared would scare away any prospective husband. And yet it had happened too quickly, too inexplicably, and she had no way to hide it. Her auburn hair had once tumbled down to her waist in autumn waves, but a chill fever had swept through her town 6 months ago, and she woke one morning to find it turned the color of fresh snow. She adjusted the blanket over her slim shoulders, glancing through the window at the barren expanse that stretched beyond the low wooden buildings of Mercy Ridge. Everything about the place seemed suspended between silence and memory. The weathered boards of the storefronts, the sagging sign of the one-room schoolhouse, the general store whose windows bore posters of a world Elowen could barely imagine. Even the tumbleweeds, skittering across the parched earth, looked ghost-like under the high noon sun. In Elowen's mind, the letters she had written weighed heavier than the satchel itself. She had described herself in honest strokes. Born to a mill worker in Franklin Falls, orphaned by the influenza that claimed both parents, taught to read and write by the kindly widow who took her in, but abandoned again when the widow moved west in search of work. Elowen had stayed behind, earning her keep as a seamstress, turning out fine garments by lamplight, while her hair darkened from childhood brown to burnished mahogany. She never dreamed she would trade starlit nights for coyote howls, but when the fever took hold, her life turned on its head. When her hair lost every strand of color, the townsfolk whispered that she was cursed, that sickness had ravaged her from within, and that men would spurn a bride whose hair was as white as a widow's mourning veil. So she had done the only thing she could think of. She penned those letters, sent them out with trembling hope, posting them to the frontier agencies that dealt in arranged marriages. When the reply arrived from Mercy Ridge, Elowen could scarcely believe it. A rancher, a widow named Seraphina Maddox, wrote that she sought a companion, someone who could manage the homestead and keep lonely nights at bay. She said nothing of hair color, only that she valued strength and warmth in a partner. When the coach creaked to a halt, Elowen inhaled the dry, hot air scented with sagebrush and dust. She rose slowly, smoothing the folds of her cotton dress, tinted a pale lavender that she hoped would at least flatter the pallor of her hair. She placed one foot on the step, then the other, and braced herself as the driver named Jeremiah tipped his hat and opened his mouth to speak. "Miss Gray?" His voice was rough like gravel against steel. He squinted at her through the midday glare, then shook his head as though reminding himself of something. "You're to report to the Maddox ranch, not to staff at Miller's boarding house?" They said, a woman riding alone. His tone suggested incredulity. Elowen nodded. She offered him a small, polite smile. "I believe that's correct, sir." She nudged her satchel forward, and Jeremiah reached down to lift it, hesitating for a heartbeat as he noticed those ghost-white locks, which glinted like moonlight. "You'll find the Maddox place about 2 miles out of town," he said, turning to point along a dirt track leading east. "Can't miss it. 2-story frame house, whitewashed, big windmill out back." He handed her the satchel. "Best be on your way." Elowen thanked him quietly, then watched as his carriage rattled away, the lazy wheels stirring up dust that clung to her skirt in fine, stubborn particles. She set her satchel on the ground and tested her legs, which felt unsteady after hours. In the coach, Taking a deep breath, she began the trek. Mercy Ridge lay silent under the blistering sun. Only a few souls moved between buildings, a gaunt man leaning on his horse's flank, a child clutching a ragged doll, and a tall figure propped on crutches outside the saloon's swinging doors. Elowen kept her gaze straight ahead, but she could feel their eyes on her, the pity, the curiosity, the unspoken question. What brings a white-haired woman to Mercy Ridge? She tightened her grip on the satchel as a dry wind curled around her ankles. The Maddox Ranch came into view when the road curved eastward and the town's last weathered storefront faded behind her. The land opened into a broad plain, dotted by scrub pines and patches of sage. There, a white frame house stood, like a sentinel, its porch wide enough to shelter a dozen people from sun and rain. A windmill loomed just beyond, its metal arms glinting. Barns, corrals, and cattle pens spread out like the spokes of a wagon wheel, a testament to Serafina's years on horseback and ranching. Elowen hesitated at the gate, her stomach tightening, as if she stood on the edge of a cliff. She had practiced the greeting Serafina had requested in her letter, a simple, respectful introduction, plus a brief list of the skills she possessed: sewing, cooking, bookkeeping. And yet now, face to face with a ranch, a home, and the woman who awaited her inside, she felt the numbness of fear coil through her chest. The gate swung open before she touched it, and a chestnut mare emerged from the yard, stamping its hoof, and toss of its mane like a gesture of ownership. A woman stepped down from the porch, pulling her wide-brimmed hat low. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, and her posture was a blend of toughness and grace. Her eyes, the color of chipped glass, tracked Elowen's approach. Serafina Maddox was the first to break the silence. "I reckon you're Elowen Gray," she said. Her voice was low and steady, with a hint of weariness. Despite the heat, she wore a tailored riding duster over a simple blouse and trousers. Dust clung to the seams like a second skin. Elowen nodded, stepping forward with deliberate calm. "Yes, ma'am, I am." She knelt to set her satchel on the ground, then rose again. She folded her hands before her, elbows brushing against her sides. "I'm honored by your letter, Mrs. Maddox. I hope I can be of service to you and your ranch." Serafina narrowed her gaze, stepping closer to examine Elowen's face. The intensity of her stare made Elowen's cheeks flush, but she wouldn't look away. Inwardly, she braced against the weight of Serafina's scrutiny. Finally, the rancher nodded once, a subtle measuring motion. "You can call me Serafina." She gestured toward the porch. "Come up here. We'll talk." Elowen climbed the wooden steps, each plank creaking under her boots. On the porch, a rocking chair creaked in the breeze, and a chipped enamel basin sat next to a pitcher of cold water. Serafina motioned toward a sturdy oak table just inside the doorway. Elowen followed, settling into a chair, her back straight. Serafina remained standing, leaning against the doorframe. "I got your letters," Serafina said, laying a leather-bound ledger on the table. "I know you can sew, cook, and keep account books. You said you've experience tending to animals? Naming brand and ill-fitting horses doesn't make you a ranch hand. Can you ride?" Elowen swallowed, then straightened her shoulders. "I can. I learned to ride as a child back in Franklin Falls. I haven't had a mount in months, but—" Serafina's lips twitched, neither a smile nor a sneer. "Horses either take to you or they don't. Your hair." She paused, as though she could see something swirling inside Elowen's trembling chest. "Your hair's white. Do you know why?" Elowen closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of linseed oil and saddle leather that drifted in on the breeze. She opened them again, meeting Serafina's gaze with unflinching resolve. "I had a fever last winter that turned it white. I was ill for weeks, and I lost my parents. Then when I recovered, my hair was the only thing left as a reminder, I suppose." Serafina leaned forward, elbows on the table. She studied Elowen's face, those silver locks framing her narrow features like a halo. She saw more than the hair, the slender jaw with its stubborn line, the pale blue eyes flecked with determination, the hands that showed faint calluses from needle and thread. She saw the lingering grief in her expression, a silent well Eloan tried to keep hidden. "You're a brave one," Seraphina said after a measured pause. "Most women wouldn't dare show up here looking like they fell out of a snowstorm." A flush rose in Eloan's cheeks, mingling embarrassment and anger. She drew in a steadying breath. "My hair should not matter more than my work. I came here to make a life, not to be pitied." The words tasted bitter, but she spoke them with a quiet ferocity. Seraphina straightened, rising from the table without another word. She walked past Eloan to a dusty cabinet and unlocked it, retrieving a wooden cup and filling it with water. Then she crossed back to Eloan, leaning against the far wall. She held the cup out as though offering a gesture of peace. Eloan reached for the cup and took a cautious sip. The water was cool, slightly metallic from the well. She swallowed. "It's true, I need someone to help manage this ranch." Seraphina's voice softened. "When my husband died, killed in a stampede last spring, I thought I could handle things on my own. I was wrong. My hands can't keep up with the fences, and my heart can't bear the loneliness." She looked away, as if she could still hear the thunder of wild horses bearing down on her husband. Eloan's pulse quickened. In that flicker of vulnerability, she saw the woman's true need. Not a wife, an ally. "I'm sorry for your loss," Eloan said softly. "I've lost people I loved too." She paused, choosing words carefully. "I can be what you need me to be. I'm willing to learn. Please, Mrs. Maddox, Seraphina, give me a chance." Seraphina's gaze returned to Eloan, and she nodded, slowly. "All right, I'll give you a chance. You can start tomorrow. We'll see if you can ride out to the north pastures and check the calves, and then help me sort the feed. If you do well, I'll keep you on. If not, well, you'll find that Mercy Ridge isn't kind to the unsuccessful." Eloan's heart fluttered. She bowed her head in gratitude. "Thank you. I won't disappoint you." Seraphina's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Good. Now, you'll stay here tonight. There's a wagon I'll send back with you. Soon, get yourself cleaned up, eat something. You look like you could use a decent meal." Eloan nodded again, her relief flickering with caution. She rose and followed Seraphina out into the heat. The ranch's cookhouse stood behind the main house, a modest structure with a brick hearth that sagged with use. A pot of stew simmered over the embers, and the aroma of onion and beef drifted lazily. As Eloan settled at the rough-hewn wooden table, Seraphina's hired hand, Jed Callahan, slid a bowl of stew in front of her. Jed was a man of few words, burly, with a thick beard and eyes that missed nothing. He gave Eloan a curt nod before turning back to his tasks. Eloan leaned over her bowl, the spoon trembling slightly. The first taste of food in days soothed the ache in her belly. She closed her eyes, savoring the warmth, the tang of pepper, and the faint sweetness of carrots. When she opened her eyes, she saw Jed watching her from across the kitchen. Embarrassment prickled along her spine. She set down her spoon and offered him a polite nod. He returned it with a barely perceptible lift of his chin. Her eyes flicked past him to Seraphina, who stood by the hearth, arms folded against the heat. Their gazes met again, and Eloan felt the stir of something akin to promise, tempered by the knowledge that she must prove herself. The ranch was Seraphina's only link to the life she once shared, and a stranger could shatter it as easily as any stampede if she wasn't careful. After a moment, Seraphina spoke. "You'll have a cot in the East Room. I'll let Jenny, my sister, know you're here. She'll show you the way. Get some rest. We start at dawn." Eloan rose, pressing her cloth napkin to her lips, then nodded. "Thank you." She stepped outside into the haze of afternoon heat. The day's glare made the world seem to shimmer. Eloan found the East Room, a narrow chamber with a small window overlooking the corrals. A simple bed lay pressed against one wall, covered by a faded patchwork quilt. On the small desk, a lantern sat next to a stack of paper and ink. She approached the window and swept aside the thin curtain. The corral below was quiet now. The cattle lay in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, their sides rising and falling. With each lazy breath, beyond, the rolling hills rose against a sky that burned with afternoon light. Eloan placed her satchel on the floor and knelt to undo its buckles. She pulled out a scrub brush and a bar of soap. She lit the lantern and set it on the desk, then reached into her trunk for a change of clothes, a simple white chemise and a worn wool skirt. Taking a breath, she used the cold water from a pitcher to wash her face and arms, the tang of iron on her skin making her wince. When she finished, she looked at her reflection in the small hand mirror she kept for traveling. The woman staring. Back at her was a stranger, pale cheeks flushed from exertion, eyes rimmed with both hope and despair, and hair glinting like molten silver. Her reflection held the same questions she'd been asking herself since the fever. Why did I survive? And why was I cursed to bear this white hair? She set the mirror down and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the quilt to her chest. In that fragile silence, she felt every loss she had suffered, but also the fragile spark of determination that had carried her this far. She would not let her hair define her. She would not be dismissed. At last, she lay back and closed her eyes, letting exhaustion seep into her bones. The distant lowing of cattle lulled her into the edge of sleep, and as the last light fled from the sky, she thought of the days to come, the calves she would tend, the fences she would mend, the ledger she would learn to balance. Tomorrow, her true test would begin. But for now, she allowed herself the brief solace of a heartbeat spent believing that Mercy Ridge had just taken its first step toward seeing her true worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The first shafts of dawn filtered through the thin curtain, painting pale rectangles of light against the rough wood floor. Eloan Gray sat up slowly, the quilt bunched beneath her, as her body protested the unfamiliar hardness of the cot. She pressed her fingertips into the rough-grained mattress, feeling the coolness of the room settle deeper into her bones. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. The lowing of cattle had given way to an expectant silence, broken only by the distant creak of the windmill's blades cutting through the morning air. Eloan rose, brushing back a wisp of silver hair that had slipped loose. Her mind replayed Seraphina's instructions from the night before. Ride out to the north pastures, check the calves, help me sort the feed. It had sounded so simple on paper, but now, as the reality of the day pressed against her, she felt the tremor of doubt creep in. She dressed quickly in the chemise and wool skirt she had changed into, then braided her hair into a loose plait to keep it from tangling as she rode. Gathering her satchel and a coil of rope, she crept out of the room, pausing to glance at the still, empty hallway. In the kitchen, Jed Callahan was already breaking bread by the hearth, and he lifted his gaze to hers, his grey eyes nodding in acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, his voice rough as gravel but not unkind. The cookhouse fire crackled, sending a faint tang of smoke into the air. Eloan dipped her head. "Morning." He placed a squat clay mug of coffee before her and set a plate of biscuits on the table. She sat and accepted the coffee gratefully, lifting the warm cup to her lips. The dark liquid scorched her tongue at first, then settled like embers in her chest. She bit into a biscuit, but her thoughts spun around the task ahead, riding her first real test on the ranch, the possibility of failure. Just then, Seraphina entered, her boots thudding on the plank floor. She wore her riding duster again. Dust still clinging to the seams. Her expression was unreadable in the dim morning light. She moved to lean against the doorframe, watching Elowen. Elowen looked up, lowering the mug. "I won't let you down," she said, though her voice wavered. Seraphina's gaze flicked to Jed, then back to Elowen. Jed spoke up, nudging a stack of saddles by the hearth. "Horses are tied at the hitch rails. Thorn's a good mare. Docile, but watch her close if she senses you're nervous." He spat, a wad of tobacco into a basin of water near the hearth. "Horses don't like fear." Elowen swallowed, her throat dry. She rose and set the mug down, straightening her posture. She knew fear could spook a horse, but she also knew the weight of expectation pressing on her. Seraphina joined her near the saddles, methodically checking each strap and buckle. "You ready?" Seraphina asked, her tone measured. "I am," Elowen said, though her voice sounded small in the quiet kitchen. Seraphina handed her a coiled rope. "Tie this to your saddle. Might come in handy for any bulls or calves that decide to wander. The north pastures are rougher land. Ruts, loose. Ox, Thornbush, keep your wits." Elowen took the rope, nodding, then stepped outside. The early sun had cast a golden hue across the ranch, turning the dew on the grass blades to a scatter of diamonds. The corrals to her left held a handful of proud-looking stallions, their sleek coats gleaming. She spotted Thorn, a chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead, standing patiently at her post, head lowered as she chewed on blades of grass. Elowen approached slowly, laying a hand on Thorn's neck. The mare's muscles rippled beneath her warm hide, and Elowen felt her own heartbeat echo against the rhythm of the horse's breathing. She murmured softly, "Easy, girl. I'm just a friend." Thorn flicked an ear, then turned to nuzzle Elowen's tunic. The contact sent a shock of reassurance through her spine. She slipped her arm around Thorn's neck and looped the rope under the saddle horn, satisfying Seraphina's first instruction. She mounted, shifting her weight to test her balance. Thorn flinched slightly under her, sensing the rider's tension, but Elowen clenched her jaw and took a deep breath, settling her hips against the leather. Seraphina stood beside her, arms folded. "Head straight east, then north along the fence. Line. The calves were running when I last checked, wary after the storm last night. They might scatter." Elowen nodded. She kicked her heels lightly, and Thorn rose under her with the practiced ease of a seasoned ranch horse. Seraphina gave a small nod, then turned to Jed, who was loading feed bags onto a wagon. The two shared a brief look before Seraphina slipped into the house, leaving Elowen alone. The morning air seemed to swell as Elowen guided Thorn onto the dirt path. The mare's hooves clattered against the hard-packed earth, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the sunlit air. Elowen clutched the reins, feeling the familiar tug of leather against her palms, the sway of Thorn's gait beneath her. She took a slow breath, letting the motion calm her nerves. Ahead, the fence line rose like a broken spine against the horizon, fence posts leaning at odd angles where the wind had taken them years before. Elowen steered Thorn past a broken gate and into the rough expanse of the north pastures. The land here was wilder, less tended, a tangle of scrub brush and rocks dotted by patches of hardy grass. Above, circling vultures cast spinning shadows on the cracked earth. Elowen scanned the ground. She spotted hoofprints where calves had passed, then the telltale tracks of a cow's belly scraping the dirt as it churned into the earth searching for grass. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of manure and sage. Elowen tightened, her grip on the reins, leaning forward to urge Thorn to a trot. The mare responded, and soon they were weaving between clumps of mesquite, hooves clattering over jagged stones. Elowen's heart pounded as she focused on keeping Thorn steady. Each rock could send the mare stumbling, each gust of wind could catch her off guard. She felt sweat bead at her temples, but she refused to let panic take hold. In the distance, she spotted movement. A cluster of calf-sized figures huddled near a dry creek bed. Some were standing, others stretched out on the parched earth, hides the color of mottled brown and white. Elowen gasped as she realized the calves were sprawled, unnaturally, side by side, as though too tired to stand. She nudged Thorn into a canter, urging her toward the creek bed. As she approached, the calves looked up wide-eyed and restless. She saw one that lay apart from the group, its back twisted at a strange angle. A low groan escaped her lips. The calf's sides heaved with each shallow breath, its eyes dull as the dust it lay in. Elowen pressed her lips together, swallowing the pang of pity. She reached for the rope, looping it around the mare's neck to keep her steady. She slid from Thorn's back, letting her stirrup dangle as she approached the calf. A sudden gust of wind rustled the dry grasses, carrying the faint cry of crows overhead. "Elowen!" A shout rang out. She looked up to see Seraphina rounding a bend in the fence line, her duster billowing. Sedges of hay streamed from Jed's wagon behind her, the animals on the wagon restless against the jostling. "Elowen, careful!" Seraphina's voice was taut with urgency. She vaulted off her horse and advanced toward her, boots sinking into the soft earth. "That calf's leg is broken, flipped when its mother got spooked. We need to move quick, or it'll die out here." Elowen's breath caught. She knelt beside the calf, careful as she smoothed her hand over its trembling flank. The calf's leg lay bent beneath it, bone protruding where skin had split. Blood trickled through the coarse brown fur, mingling with dust. "We need to get it back to the barn," Seraphina said, kneeling at Elowen's side. "Can you hold it still? I'll go fetch the sling." She ran a hand along the calf's shoulder, murmuring something lowly like a prayer. Elowen nodded, heart pounding. She felt the calf's heat, its rapid breathing against her fingertips, and a thrill of adrenaline surged through her. She positioned her weight beside the calf, bracing herself as it struggled. For a moment, fear spiked. What if she failed? What if the calf slipped from her grasp and died alone in the dust? She inhaled, straightened her spine, and focused on Seraphina's presence beside her. Seraphina returned with a crude sling fashioned from burlap, the coarse fabric stained with dark smudges. She knelt and began to wrap the calf's leg, her hands firm, precise. Tension knotted in Elowen's chest as she felt the calf's muscles clench beneath her palm. "We'll lift it onto my saddle," Seraphina said, glancing at Elowen. "We can't ride back with it loose on the ground. Too risky. I'll hold the front, you guide the back." They moved as one. Seraphina gathered beneath the calf's shoulders. Elowen slid her arms under the hindquarters. The calf thrashed, and Elowen braced her knees against the ground, gritting her teeth as they hefted. Thorn whinnied, stamping her hoof as though protesting the interruption. Elowen exhaled, sweat stinging her eyes as they shifted the weight. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, steady and loud. With a final heave, they lifted the calf. Onto Thorn's back, Seraphina at the head, Elowen supporting the hips. The calf grunted, buckling at the knees, and Elowen felt the agony of its broken limb radiate into her own arms. Seraphina settled the calf, rolling it gently onto the mare's blanket, then climbed into the saddle. Elowen rose, shaky but determined, and vaulted onto Thorn's back, behind Seraphina. The mare's broad back felt sturdy beneath her, and Thorn shifted forward, testing her new burden. Elowen squeezed her thighs, holding onto Seraphina's belt as Thorn began a slow, careful walk back toward the ranch. Each step was a test. Thorn watched her footing, Elowen kept her weight even, and Seraphina murmured low words to the calf. The ride back stretched like a tightrope between hope and disaster. Elowen's senses sharpened, the calf's hot breath. Against her calf, the grit of dust in her throat, the sun's harsh glare on Seraphina's dusty duster. She felt the hum of Seraphina's practiced confidence before her, the calm assuredness that came from years of ranching. The contrast between her own fumbling nerves and Seraphina's steadiness galvanized her. A sudden spasm from the calf sent a jolt through Thorn's back, and the horse's hooves faltered on a loose rock. Seraphina hissed and tightened her grip on the reins, guiding Thorn around a gnarled mesquite root. Eloan fought the urge to panic as Thorn shifted beneath her, muscles taut. Seraphina shot her a glance. "Steady," she whispered, voice calm yet urgent. "Ease up on the left. Watch for rocks." Eloan shifted her grip, leaning in sync with Seraphina's weight. They inched forward, Thorn's hooves clicking against the hard earth, dust spiraling in their wake. Behind them, the ranch framed itself against the sunrise. The whitewashed house, the lean-to cookhouse, the barns knee-deep in slatted shadows. Relief washed through Eloan's chest, but she couldn't let up yet. The calf's breaths rattled in her ears, a raw reminder of the stakes. At last, they reached the barn. Seraphina slid from Thorn's back, and Eloan followed, her legs trembling beneath her. Jed emerged from the barn's shade, a blanket in his hands. "Help me," Seraphina commanded. Together they eased the calf from Thorn's back, setting it gently onto the blanket. The calf let out a final, ragged whimper as its legs collapsed. Beneath it, they carried the calf into the barn's dim interior, where the smell of hay and manure mingled with the sweet tang of molasses jars stacked on a shelf. Seraphina instructed Jed to fetch warm water, while Eloan knelt beside the calf, cradling its head in her lap. The calf's eyes fluttered. Eloan brushed back a damp strand of its coarse hair. Pain lanced through her chest. She fought to keep her voice steady. "Easy now, you're safe." Seraphina returned, carrying a pan of warm, soapy water. She dipped a rag and began to clean the calf's wounds, her face set in a mask of concentration. Eloan watched, heart hammering, as Jed mixed antiseptic into the water and passed Seraphina a tin canister of salve. Eloan's hands trembled as she reached for a cloth to help. She tried to distract herself by focusing on the smell of lavender in the salve and the smooth grain of the wooden stall post beneath her palm. The barn's rafters creaked, and a slant of morning light pierced the dust motes floating in the air. Suddenly the calf jerked, arching its back. The air in the barn contracted as though snapped by an unseen hand. Eloan gasped, her hands tightening on the rag. She met Seraphina's eyes, and for a fleeting moment she saw something unspoken, the fragility of life, the razor's edge between success and failure. Then the calf settled again, whimpering, its sides heaving with effort. Seraphina dabbed the salve on the wound, and Eloan held the rag steady, refusing to look away. Once the calf was bandaged, Jed carried it into a small pen lined with fresh straw. Eloan helped, her hands aching. She watched as the calf settled on the straw, its breathing more even now. Seraphina stood close, arms crossed over her chest. She turned to Eloan. "You did good." Eloan looked down at her hands, stained with the calf's blood and dust. Exhaustion tugged at her bones, but relief warmed her chest. She dared a small smile. "I'm glad it's safe." Seraphina's lips curved. "Come." She guided Eloan out of the barn and into the bright morning. They paused at the threshold, the ranch stretching before them, the sky a vast expanse of blue. "You earned your keep this morning," Seraphina said, "but there's still much to do. We've got hay to stack, fences to repair, and the rest of the herd needs checking." Eloan nodded, despite the ache in every muscle. She felt something shift inside her, a sense of purpose, a spark of confidence. She would not fail. She turned to follow Seraphina back toward the ranch yard. Her boots scuffed the ground, and the world thrummed with possibility and peril. She inhaled the sharp scent of sage and manure, the promise of work that tested a person's limits. Halfway across the yard, Jed caught up and handed her a lantern. Confusion flickered across Eloan's face until she realized what it was for. "We're taking the herd back to the lower pastures tonight. There's a canyon road that'll be dangerous in the dark. I want you to lead the way with the lantern, keep the cattle from wandering off the path." Eloan's breath snagged, Riding at night? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she straightened her shoulders and said, "Yes, sir. I can do that." Serafina nodded. "Good. Meet me by the gate at dusk. Until then we work." Elowen watched as Jed and Serafina moved off, one to fetch tools, the other to gather supplies. She clutched the lantern, its cool metal a stark contrast to her clammy palms. The sun had climbed higher now, and heat rippled off the ground like a mirage. She took a deep breath and squared her jaw. Today would push her limits further still, but she would not back down. She strode toward the haystack, feeling the weight of Thorn's earlier burden still lingering in her muscles, the ache a reminder of life's precarious balance. She reached the stack and gathered a pitchfork. As she turned, the sun glinted off her silver hair, casting it in a halo of light. At that moment, Elowen realized they had taken a chance on her, and she would repay it with every drop of sweat. And blood she had. She stepped forward, pitchfork in hand, her heart beating with fierce determination. Mercy Ridge would see her value yet. The midday sun pressed down with merciless intensity as Elowen Gray hoisted her second pitchfork full of hay onto the wagon's flattened bed. Each forkful was heavy as lead, yet she refused to let her arms tremble. The heat soaked through her, cotton chemise sticking to her skin like a second layer. She wiped sweat from her brow with a calloused hand, but the sting of salt in her eyes did nothing to deter her. Beside her, Jed Callahan worked in silence, stacking hay with practiced efficiency. His broad shoulders glistened with sweat, and every now and then he spared Elowen a sidelong glance. She met his gaze with a determined expression, refusing to let him see the nerves still fluttering beneath her calm exterior. Serafina Maddox stood at the wagon's front, her silhouette outlined by the shimmering heat. She shaded her eyes with one hand scanning the horizon as though hunting for trouble. When she saw Elowen pause, she called out, voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Keep it moving, girl! This stack isn't going to build itself." Elowen dipped her head and resumed her task. The rhythm of her labor settled something deep in her chest. The scrape of the hay, the grunt of effort, the reassurance that each forkful brought them one step closer to feeding the herd this winter. She focused on the feel of the dry stalks beneath her fingertips, how they insisted on snapping free from the bundles until she secured them with the rope Serafina had taught her to tie. As she worked, a memory sifted through her mind like dust on a sunbeam. She recalled sitting in the grey-fogged parlour of the boarding house in Franklin Falls, stitching dresses for the well-to-do families who paid enough to keep her sheltered. Her hands had been nimble then, each seam as precise as a surgeon's cut. But those days seemed distant now, like a portrait hung in a gallery she could no longer reach. The memory faded as quickly as it appeared, and Elowen gave a small shake of her head, refocusing on the task. She tossed the fork aside, stepping back as Jed secured the last bundle. The stack rose before them, a solid wall of golden straw that would feed the cattle until spring rain coaxed fresh grass from the ground. Serafina swung down from the wagon. A shaft of sweat trickled down her neck, disappearing beneath her duster. She wiped her hand across her brow. "Well done. That stack looks solid. Now we move on to the fence." Elowen wiped her palms on her skirt and followed Serafina toward the perimeter fence. The railings ran for half a mile, a broken line of splintered wood and rusted wire. Thorn grazed nearby, tethered to a post with a frayed rope. Elowen stroked the mare's neck, murmuring a quiet apology for having abandoned her earlier. Serafina handed Elowen a hammer and a bundle of wire. "Help me mend this section here. The cattle pushed through during that hailstorm last night." She pointed to a swath of ground where fence posts lay scattered, splintered like kindling. Elowen picked up a post and examined it. The wood was splintered at the base, an ugly crack zigzagging from top to bottom. She glanced at Serafina. "I'll replace it," she said, dropping the post into the dirt. She knelt and began hammering a new post, sweat pouring down her face. Serafina knelt beside her, twisting a length of wire around the new post's rail. Eloan matched her movements, guiding the wire through the worn loops. Neither spoke for several minutes, the only sound the clang of metal and the low hum of cicadas. Finally, Serafina straightened, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "You're learning fast," she said, and for a moment her tone held genuine warmth. Eloan dared to look up, meeting her gaze. In that instant, she saw a flicker of approval in Serafina's eyes, and that small flicker ignited something in her. She nodded, though breathlessly. "Thank you." She shifted, hammering a nail that secured the wire to the post. A hard blow cracked the wood, sending a splinter into her fingertip. She hissed, pulling back. Serafina sprang forward and yanked the nail free, tossing it aside. She crushed the splinter beneath her boot. Eloan's breath caught as blood welled up. Serafina grabbed her hand and produced a scrap of cloth from her pocket, pressing it to Eloan's wound. "Keep working," Serafina said, voice firm but not unkind. "We'll tend to that later." Eloan nodded, tightening her grip on the wire. The pain radiated up her arm, but she refused to let it slow her. Step by step they repaired the fence, hammering nails and twisting wire until the gap was closed. When they finished, Serafina stood back to inspect their work. "Yes," she said, pride threading through her voice. "That'll hold until we can replace the rail tomorrow." She angled her chin toward Eloan's hand. "That looked nasty. We need to clean it." Before Eloan could protest, Serafina was already unwrapping the cloth, revealing the red slit in her skin. She instructed Eloan to stick out her hand. Eloan complied, grimacing as Serafina swabbed the wound with a rag soaked in whiskey. "Hold still," Serafina snapped, though the frustration in her voice wasn't directed at Eloan. It was something deeper, a reminder of the dangers of ranch life. Eloan clenched her jaw, closing her eyes as the whiskey stung. When Serafina finished, she bandaged the cut with a fresh cloth. Eloan flexed her fingers, tasting copper on her tongue where her teeth had pressed her bottom lip. Serafina's lips quirked in the faintest hint of a smile. "You'll bleed plenty more out here. Get used to it." Eloan offered a small, wry grin. "I suppose I will." Serafina glanced toward the west, where dark clouds had gathered beyond the hills. "Storm's coming. We need to finish up and head back to the house before it hits." She slung an arm over Eloan's shoulders. "Let's move." They walked back together, the sun shrouded by rolling clouds. Eloan felt the first drop of rain on her cheek, then another. Soon the sky above them was a swirling canvas of charcoal, and the wind whipped up, carrying the scent of ozone. They raced to the corral gates to gather the remaining cattle. Thunder rumbled, and Eloan's stomach twisted into knots. She clutched. The lantern Jed had given her the previous evening, the metal handle cool against her skin. She had never led a herd at night, let alone in a storm. When the first bolt of lightning split the sky, she froze. Serafina grabbed her arm, pulling her into a dim doorway of the barn. They pressed against the wall as a jagged bolt struck a lone tree at the edge of the field, sending a spray of sparks into the night. "Eloan, breathe," Serafina urged, voice tight. "We won't do this now. We'll wait it out until it passes." Eloan's chest heaved. Her heart felt doubled in size, hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pressed her eyes shut, fighting the instinct to bolt, to escape the thunderous roar. After a moment, Serafina tightened her hold. "Come, we'll ride out and round them up once the worst blows over." Eloan nodded, her legs trembling. She clutched the lantern firmly, and together they emerged into the storm's fury. The rain pelted her with relentless force, each drop a sting against her bare cheek. The wind gusted sideways, carrying with it a swirl of dust and straw. She lifted the lantern, its feeble glow swallowed by the storm's black maw. A calf screamed. Somewhere in the distance, and Eloin's heart stuttered. She followed Seraphina toward the corral, the thunder's drumbeats rattling her bones. Each step was a gamble. A loose rock underfoot could send her sprawling, and her lamp could go out in a breath. They reached the gate, and Seraphina kicked it open. The cattle within the pen huddled together, eyes wide and frantic. Eloin felt a surge of panic. A herd stampede could kill them all. She lifted the lantern higher, its flame flickering in defiance of the wind. "Steady!" Seraphina shouted, her voice lost in the storm. "We'll drive them to the barn. Come on!" Eloin spurred her horse forward, her hands shaking as she guided Thorn into position. The mare reared, startled by the thunder cracking above. "Eloin!" Seraphina shouted, and Eloin's vision tunneled. She forced herself to focus on Thorn's neck, her voice barely audible against the roaring wind. "It's okay, we can do this." She leaned close, resting her cheek against Thorn's mane. A bolt of lightning cracked close overhead, illuminating Thorn's wide eyes. In that flash, Eloin saw the reflection of her own fear, bright and indisputable. Panic flared hot and sharp. She clenched the reins, guiding Thorn back to Seraphina. The rancher had vaulted onto her own horse and was gathering the nearest cows, prodding them toward the barn with a long pole. Eloin swallowed, her throat raw. She took a trembling breath and gave Thorn a gentle nudge. The mare lunged forward, hooves pounding into the sodden ground. The first cow stumbled out of the corral, followed by another. Eloin watched them, and then, as if released from invisible bonds, the rest surged behind them. A calf broke away, darting across the open field. A flash of lightning revealed a yawning ravine just beyond the wet grass, the dark pit yawning like a hungry maw. Eloin's heart lurched. If that calf fell, it would be lost, or worse, trapped where they couldn't rescue it. "Eloin, get it!" Seraphina's voice cut through the storm. She guided her horse parallel to Eloin's, driving the herd, but allowing gaps. Eloin spurred Thorn to follow the calf's path. The mare's legs churned through the churned-up earth, mud splattering. Her ankles. Eloin's silver hair whipped across her face, plastered with rain. She could feel the calf's panic beneath her. It hesitated, then darted again. Lightning flared, and Eloin's stomach dropped as the calf skidded on the slick ground toward the edge of the ravine. "Eloin, now!" Seraphina's cry was a razor in the storm. Eloin lunged forward in the saddle, extending the coil of rope she had tied earlier. The rope flew in a wide arc and miraculously landed around the calf's hind legs. The animal stumbled, bucking as it tried to free itself, but the loop tightened. Thorn reared, and Eloin's heart throbbed. She leaned forward, hooking her arm around the calf's rump as Seraphina rushed in from the other side. The three of them pulled in unison. A final bolt of lightning illuminated their struggle. The calf's frantic eyes, Thorn's flared nostrils, Seraphina's determined grimace. Then, with a shuddering heave, they dragged the calf to solid ground. It lagged, panting on the brink of collapse. Eloin pressed her boot against its flank, forcing it away from the ravine's edge. Seraphina grabbed its head, keeping its eyes from rolling back. Rain stung Eloin's cheeks as she leaned back, letting the rope slack, chest heaving with relief. But just as she thought the crisis had passed, a roar of thunder like a cannon's blast shook the ground beneath her. The calf panicked again, and the rope frayed with a loud snap. It bolted, plunging toward the ravine's edge. Eloin's blood froze. She lunged forward, but Thorn slipped in the mud, the mare's hooves splaying. Eloin slid from the saddle, arms flailing. A crack echoed through the night as the calf went over the edge. Eloin's scream was swallowed by the storm as the animal vanished into darkness, its fate unknown. Seraphina's voice reached her just as the first bolts of fear had settled in her chest. "Eloin, look out!" Before she could react, a jagged shape loomed in the path of a second lumbering horse, its eyes wild with panic. The horse came at her like a freight train, hooves churning mud into a fine powder. Eloin's world tilted as the horse charged, and everything slowed. the flash of its teeth, the sputter of its nostrils, the thunder of its hooves. She shouted a warning, but her voice was lost in the storm. And then the world went black. When Elowen Grey pitched forward, her consciousness shattered like a fragile pane of glass. The thundering hooves of the panicked horse blurred over her vision as darkness claimed her. She felt the ground approach in slow motion, a faint rasp of leather, a flash of metal from her lantern, and then nothing. When she awoke, Elowen's first awareness was the sting of rain on her cheek, a cold, rhythmic patter that pulled her from the void. Her mind clawed through a thick fog of pain and confusion. Her cheek pressed against the damp earth, muddy and uneven. She tried to turn, but her head felt as though two blacksmiths had hammered rivets behind her eyes. A sharp ache radiated through her skull. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the storm-lashed field in ghostly white. The horse lay nearby, its body heaving, blind panic echoing in its labored breaths. Elowen's vision shifted as her senses returned. She felt the shudder of rain, smelled the tang of ozone and wet hay, and heard distant thunder roll like artillery fire. Instinct flared. She scrambled to push herself onto her knees, mud clinging to her bloodied chemise. She tested her limbs, wincing as agony flared along her side. Something inside her ribs was bruised, perhaps even fractured. Each movement spurred a fresh wave of nausea. Elowen! The cry came from somewhere in the darkness, a raw note of fear. Then another voice, Seraphina's, clipped and urgent. "Stay with me! Don't! You can't drift off!" A curtain of rain parted enough to reveal Seraphina's silhouette, hunched over Elowen as she knelt in the mud, her duster plastered to her bones. Thorn, the mare, snorted and stamped a restless hoof, panic flickering in her eyes whenever she sensed Elowen's stillness. Elowen tried to speak, but her throat tightened around the single word stuck there. Her hand reached up to cradle the side of her head, finding warmth and wetness where blood matted her hair. She blinked twice, forcing her eyes to focus on Seraphina's face. Her vision swam. Seraphina seemed magnified, looming over her like a mountain of determination. "We've got to get you back to the barn," Seraphina murmured, her voice taut. "Stay awake. You can't pass out again." Elowen nodded, but her mind refused to cooperate. She tried to push away Seraphina's hand, but her limbs felt like lead. "Jed!" Seraphina's voice cracked like a whip through the storm. "Bring the spare blankets and hurry!" The tall silhouette of Jed Callahan emerged from the barn shadows. Carrying a folded blanket over one arm, he knelt beside Seraphina and deftly placed the blanket beneath Elowen's shoulders, lifting her carefully as though she were a brittle artifact. "Elowen, this way," Seraphina said, motioning with her head toward the barn's open door. Elowen felt her weight shift as they lifted her between them, leaving the muddy ground behind. The barn's warm glow roared in contrast to the storm's chill, and hay-strewn air replaced the biting wind. A single lantern flickered in the rafters, casting dancing shadows on the hay-littered floor. They eased her onto a bale of hay, and Seraphina knelt, examining the cuts and bruises sprouting over Elowen's skin. Her fingers were gentle as they brushed back a strand of wet hair, revealing a thin gash at the temple. She pressed a damp rag to it, the rag soaked in whiskey that stung like fire. Elowen's breath caught and trembled, but she forced herself to remain conscious. Her chest heaved, each breath like ripping cloth. Pain lanced through her right side when she tried to inhale deeply. "Shit," Jed muttered, his gaze flicking to Seraphina. "She's got a bad bump on her head, and her side's swollen. Think she cracked a rib." Seraphina's face hardened, but her eyes flicked with concern. "We need to keep her still until that storm passes. Get blankets and water. We'll tend to her properly once it calms." Jed rose, disappearing into the gloom beyond the barn's threshold. Elowen tried to speak, but only a hollow groan escaped her lips. Seraphina laid a hand on Elowen's shoulder. "Easy, Elowen. Just rest." Elowen closed her eyes. The barn's warmth felt surreal against the whipping rain outside. She drifted between consciousness and blackness, each flash of lightning dragging her back to present horrors. The calf's fall, the storm's fury, Thorn's panicked whinny. In the fractured moments she remained aware, she saw Seraphina's face, blurred with worry. She felt hands pressing cool cloth to her forehead and the taste of salt and whiskey on her lips. The world tilted, and she surrendered to the darkness again. When the storm finally broke, it left a thick fog hanging low to the ground, as though the earth exhaled with relief. Grey light filtered through the rafters, illuminating the barn in a pale, somber glow. Someone shifted beside her, and Elowen's eyes fluttered open. Seraphina sat at her side, a wool blanket draped around Elowen's shoulders. The rancher's riding duster lay at her feet, its dust and mud caked around the hem. The faint smell of liniment and straw mixed in the air. "Elowen," Seraphina murmured, voice hoarse. She reached out and brushed a damp wisp of hair from Elowen's forehead. "Welcome back!" Elowen's head swam. She forced herself to focus. She raised a trembling hand to her side, where a gentle ache throbbed. The blanket shifted when she moved it. "Easy," Seraphina cautioned, shifting. Into a kneel, she pressed a gloved hand to Elowen's ribs, wincing at the reaction. "I think it's a cracked rib, maybe two. No severe bleeding, but we'll need to wrap it." Elowen swallowed, mouth dry. What happened?" she rasped. Seraphina sighed, looking away. "The calf went over the ravine. I couldn't save it in time. Then a runaway horse spooked and you—" Her voice caught, the clipped edge of her usual composure gone. "You got between the horse and the calf. The horse panicked, threw you down." Elowen's stomach twisted. Did that mean the calf was lost? A pang of grief surrounded her, but it was tangled with relief that she was alive. She closed her eyes, willing her head to stop spinning. Seraphina pulled a small coil of cloth from a saddlebag tucked in a corner of the barn. She unrolled it, revealing a bandage dampened with herbal salve. She asked in a low voice, "Can you sit up enough for me to wrap this around you?" Elowen drew a shaky breath and nodded. Seraphina helped her roll onto her side, supporting her weight. The movement felt like knives across her ribs, but she forced herself not to cry out. Seraphina's hands were steady as she wrapped the bandage, each loop of cloth precise. Elowen's fingers drummed against the hay as she fought to keep still. When Seraphina finished, she tucked the end of the strip and patted it. "That'll hold. Now rest. I'm heading into town to check on supplies and let Jed handle you while I'm gone." Before Elowen could respond, Seraphina stood and disappeared through the open barn door. A sliver of light followed her, and then the barn was silent. Elowen lay back, letting the fog return to her mind. When next she stirred, the barn's heavy wooden door was closed, and thin rays of sun crept between the boards. Jed sat in a chair beside her, a pot of tea and a tin cup resting on a small crate. He offered her the cup. "Drink this. It'll ease the pain." Elowen sipped, tasting the bitterness of sage and the faint sweetness of honey. She closed her eyes, drawing warmth into her chest. "You're strong," Jed said quietly, not looking at her. "Not many folks would get back up after a fall like that." Elowen's breath caught. Did he know she was fighting more than just a broken body? She nodded, though her head throbbed. "I have to be." He gave a curt nod and let silence settle around them. Elowen's legs and arms ached from bruises, her ribs ached from each breath. Yet despite it all, a spark of pride flickered inside her. She had survived, and she had saved the calf. Almost. Time passed in hazy streaks of light and shadow. Jed brought her bread at midday, and she nibbled at it, forcing herself to eat to keep her strength. Each swallow took effort, but she prevailed. When evening came, Seraphina returned, her face shadowed. Elowen forced her eyes to open, meeting Seraphina's gaze. "How are things?" she asked. Seraphina's jaw clenched, and for the first time, Elowen saw a crack in the ranch's facade. It's bad. Mercy Ridge is preparing for the storm's aftermath. Ranchers up the canyon lost livestock. Some are worse off than we are. Elowen's mind reeled at the thought of more suffering beyond the ranch. She swallowed, tightening her grip on the blanket. Despite her pain, her concern spread beyond herself. Seraphina nodded, staring at Elowen, as though weighing a decision. Elowen, I need to send word to the town council about the calf and the horse. They might want to auction them for meat if they can't recover them. Elowen's chest tightened. To her, those animals were more than property. They were lives. She closed her eyes. No, she whispered. Let me go. I can manage. The words were brittle, but resolute. Seraphina's gaze narrowed. You can barely sit up. Elowen set her jaw, forcing herself to sit upright. She ignored the stabbing pain in her ribs. I have to try. I need to help you. A flicker of respect passed through Seraphina's eyes. She knelt and offered her arm so Elowen could swing her legs over the hay bale. Elowen's breath seized, but she kept her face still. Seraphina took her hand, guiding her toward the door. She supported Elowen's weight, keeping her steadied as they reached the barn's threshold. A gust of wind blew in with damp chill, and Elowen shivered. Jed opened the saddlebags of his horse. A battered satchel hung within, and Seraphina slipped. A letter inside Elowen's trembling hand. Take this to the sheriff in town, Seraphina said. Tell him we need to recoup losses. You'll ride on Thorn. Jed will lead you. Stay safe. Elowen nodded, closing her fingers around the letters. Edge. The words on that page might mean the difference between Mercy Ridge's survival and ruin. She swallowed, suppressing the whimper in her chest as Seraphina helped her into Thorn's saddle. The mare whinnied softly, sensing Elowen's pain. Elowen adjusted herself, pressing her heels into Thorn's flanks. A jolt of agony shot through her ribs, and she clenched her teeth. Seraphina rubbed Thorn's neck once, then mounted her own horse. She sat for a moment, looking at Elowen as though memorizing her face. I'll wait by the edge of town, Seraphina said. Her voice held. An unspoken warning. Return safely, Elowen swallowed, nodding. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air expand her chest despite the pain. Jed positioned his horse before them, guiding the way down the muddy track that led toward Mercy Ridge. Each step Thorn took sent a ripple of agony through Elowen's ribs, but she refused to let her body betray her determination. The storm's aftermath had reshaped the world. The trail was slick with mud, and puddles the size of bathtubs reflected an angry sky. Trees lay across fences, and battered signposts leaned crooked at the roadside. Mercy Ridge itself appeared half-drowned under washed-out roads and broken lines of fence. Elowen's eyes stung from the cold wind, her focus narrowing to the letter in her hand, its words a lifeline for the ranch. She urged Thorn forward, each breath a battle. The town stretched before them, a smattering of low buildings lined along a muddy main street. As they approached, a cluster of men in weather-beaten coats gathered outside the sheriff's office. The sign above the door sputtered with peeling. Paint, Sheriff Marshal's office. A crooked spire of smoke rose from a chimney behind it. Elowen spurred Thorn to a walk, and Jed slowed to let her approach. By the time they reached the steps, her legs quivered with exhaustion. The sheriff, a barrel-chested man with a bristled mustache, stepped onto the porch. He squinted down as Elowen dismounted, offering to hold her up. She refused the support, trying to stand on her own. A flame of embarrassment flared in her chest. Miss Gray, the sheriff said, taking the letter. What brings you into town? His eyes flicked to the letter, then to the battered state of Elowen's clothing. Elowen inhaled, bracing her shoulders. My employer, Seraphina Maddox, needs to recoup her losses. The storm destroyed livestock and damaged property. This letter, Requests the sale or auction of whatever remains, so her ranch can survive. She held up the letter, voice steady despite the pain coursing through her. The sheriff unfolded the paper and scanned its contents, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the men shifted, curiosity and pity mixing in their gazes. A sudden rumble of thunder punctuated the moment, and lightning crackled overhead. A gust of wind rattled the building's porch boards. The sheriff's eyes locked onto Elowen's. This is a tall order. He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. Come inside, girl. We'll discuss this. Elowen nodded, refusing. The throb in her temples. She stepped into the dim office behind him. The lantern atop the desk flickered, illuminating ledgers splayed across the surface. The scent of ink and dust hung heavy. The sheriff gestured to a chair. Elowen rose to sit, determined not to falter. Behind her, the door closed with a hollow click. The sheriff leaned forward. Your employer is taking a risk, he said. Folks in Mercy Ridge are strapped for cash after the storm. Auctions draw a crowd, but they also take a cut. What guarantee do we have that the proceeds return to the ranch? Elowen squared her shoulders. Serafina is the highest bidder on her own property. She's put up enough collateral. You have my word, she'll honor the transaction. A thin line of the sheriff's lips curled. Your word? Elowen met his gaze, each beat of her heart a hammer. My word. Behind her, the door creaked open. Jed stepped in, hands tucked into his coat pockets. The sheriff's eyes narrowed, studying Jed's unyielding expression. Sheriff, can I have a word? Jed said, voice low. When the sheriff nodded, Jed leaned close, speaking words too soft for Elowen to hear. The sheriff's gaze flicked from Jed to Elowen, then he straightened. All right, he said. We'll set the auction for tomorrow morning at first light. All parties must be present. If Serafina's name isn't on the entries, you will stand as security. His gaze lingered on Elowen. Elowen's pulse thrummed. She nodded, though exhaustion clawed at her. The sheriff's gaze turned hard as flint. Get back to the ranch, if you can, and tell Serafina this meeting cost the county a fee. Elowen rose, straightening her spine. She ignored the pain that flared in her ribs with each movement. Yes, sir. Jed offered his arm again, and Elowen accepted. He escorted her and her horse to the steps where the rain had finally let up. The muddy road stretched back toward the ranch. A ribbon of brittle trust. Elowen climbed back onto Thorn, every inch of her body protesting. She clutched the reins, forcing back tears she dared not shed. Thorn shifted beneath her, sensing her. Pain, and she whispered softly, almost there. Jed led the way, spurs clicking against his horse's sides. The road was slick, and the mist clung to the air. Elowen's vision blurred, and she closed her eyes for a moment, breathing. She needed to endure. Endure for Serafina, for the ranch, even for herself. The fate of Mercy Ridge hinged on that auction tomorrow. If they failed, Serafina's legacy might vanish beneath the dust. A flash of lightning lit the sky, and in that moment, Elowen saw Thorn's silhouette framed by the ruined landscape, broken fences, scattered hay, and battered cattle pens. It was a testament to their struggle. Elowen's jaw set as they trudged through the mire. She refused to let her broken body define her. Somewhere beyond the next bend, Serafina would be waiting. Elowen swallowed, forcing her vision into focus. The distant outline of the ranch came into view. Flickers of lantern light in the barn, the silhouette of the house against the darkening sky. Relief welled in her chest, but the ache in her ribs reminded her of the stakes. They entered the corral, and Serafina emerged from the shadows, her face grim yet hopeful. Elowen, she said softly, did you get it done? Elowen nodded, guiding Thorn to a halt. We have an auction at first light. She slid from the saddle, her legs quivering with fatigue. Serafina helped steady her and glanced at her ribs. You're insane. Elowen mustered a thin smile. I have to be. Serafina's gaze softened. She wrapped her coat around Eloan's shoulders, ignoring the mud. "Go inside. Jed and I will help you. Get some rest. Tomorrow will demand everything from us." Eloan met Serafina's eyes, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something beyond determination. Affection. As she crossed the threshold to the house, she realized that Mercy Ridge might hold more than a second chance for her. It might become the only home she had ever truly known. Eloan Gray woke to the muted glow of dawn, seeping through the thin curtains. Her body felt as though it had been beaten with railroad ties, ribs throbbing, limbs heavy, and a persistent ache where the horse had struck her. She lay still, listening to the low hum of activity beyond the walls of the small bedroom. The bustle of morning drifted in, the scrape of chairs, the hushed murmurs of Jed and Serafina, and the dull clatter of boots against the wooden floor. She shifted, testing her ribs. Pain seared through her side, but she gritted her teeth and sat up. The bandage Serafina had applied yesterday was damp and stiff, wrapped tight around her torso. She lifted the quilt, stepping onto the cool floor with a tentative grimace. Outside, "The door," Serafina's voice called. "Eloan, breakfast is ready." Eloan squared her shoulders, reminding herself of why she had agreed to this ordeal. The ranch's fate hung on today's auction. She needed to stand, to demonstrate that. Serafina's demands were valid, and manage the auction herself if necessary. Despite the pain, she refused to be sidelined. She slid open the door and stepped into the hallway, where Jed stood with a lantern, handing her a plate. The morning sun cast long, pale streaks through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing. "In the air." "Eloan," Jed said, concern thickening his voice. "Take it slow." Eloan nodded, accepting the plate of eggs and bread. She settled onto a stool at the rough-hewn table, lifting the food to her lips. She chewed slowly, savoring, each bite as though it might be her last. The bread was still warm, faintly sweet from the yeast, and the eggs seasoned with just enough salt to remind her of life's small comforts. Serafina entered, her boots clicking against the floor. She held a ledger and a small pouch of coins. Her face was sharp, the lines around her eyes deep from sleepless nights. "First light is here," Serafina said, sliding the pouch onto the table. "The auction starts at sunrise. The buyers will come from miles around." Eloan nodded. "I'll be there." She brushed a strand of silver hair behind her ear, wincing as the movement tugged at her temple. Serafina studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing. "Are you sure? You look like you've ridden through hell." Eloan set down her fork, meeting Serafina's gaze. "I need to be there. I can't send Jed in my place." Serafina's lips pressed into a thin line. "All right, but if you collapse, I'll drag you away myself." Eloan offered a tight smile. "Deal." After a moment, Serafina touched her shoulder. "Get going. I'll meet you outside." Eloan rose, each movement sending a lancing pain through her ribs. She braced herself against the table, then made her way out of the house, each step a testament to her resolve. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew and wood smoke. The corral was alive with anticipation. Serafina stood tall, boots planted firmly, her horse and Jed's horse tethered nearby. Eloan climbed on too, Thorn's back, wincing as the saddle pressed against her bruised side. Thorn whinnied softly, sensing her rider's pain. Eloan pressed her heels to the mare's flanks, guiding her to stand beside Serafina's horse. "Remember the plan," Serafina said. She adjusted the brim of her hat, eyes flicking to the horizon where riders were already gathering. Eloan swallowed, nodding. "Sell what needs to be sold, but don't undercut the herd. We need enough to cover winter feed and repairs." Serafina's gaze hardened. "Agreed." A single shot rang out from atop the small platform set in the center. Of the corral, the auctioneer's signal. Horses stamped and cattle stirred, their breathing heavy with confusion. Buyers, wearing long coats and dusty hats, began approaching, their horses jostling to be closer to the action. Elowen swallowed the lump in her throat. The audience's eyes flicked over her, a young woman on a mare, ribs bandaged, hair silver. She imagined their skepticism. A bride rejected for her hair, now standing in the mud, stiff with pain, negotiating her employer's future. The auctioneer, a portly man with a trimmed grey beard, cleared his throat and raised a gavel. "Gentlemen," his voice boomed, echoing off the corral fences, "today we have an estate auction on behalf of Madame Serafina Maddox. She's offering prime cattle, horses, and preserved equipment, good enough to breathe life back into any ranch." Elowen's pulse hammered as she climbed down from Thorn. Serafina waited by the front gate, arms folded. Elowen approached her, standing just behind the auctioneer's platform. The auctioneer flipped through his papers, then held up a hand. "First, we have 12 head of yearling steer." He signaled to the pen, and the gate swung open. The cattle, their coats glistening under the rising sun, stampeded into the corral. Their eyes were bright, lacking the dullness of the storm's aftermath. The buyers leaned forward, tinkling spurs and murmuring. Elowen felt the heat of their gazes, and, despite her pain, she let the confidence she had cultivated over the past days lift her chin. One by one, the auctioneer described each lot. Elowen held Serafina's gaze, and at her nod, the cattle sold for numbers that would cover the ranch's immediate needs. With each hammer strike, relief washed over Elowen like a wave. Yet, beneath the relief lay a current of anxiety. She was not out of the storm's grip yet. After the cattle, Serafina brought forward 2 horses, Thorn, her own mare, and a sturdy bay gelding named Duke. Elowen's breath caught as Thorn nickered, her eyes seeking Elowen's. The auctioneer began, calling out bids. Elowen's rib throbbed as she clutched Serafina's sleeve. "Hold," Serafina said, delivering a precise whisper that cut through the cacophony. "I won't sell Thorn. She's the only mount I trust." The auctioneer nodded, then turned to Duke. "Now this gelding is a fine creature, 3 years old, broken well. Any takers?" A murmured bidding war erupted. Elowen watched as Duke was sold for a sum that brought a flush of success to Serafina's cheeks. Finally, Serafina directed Elowen to present the remaining items: barrels of supplies, harnesses and tools, each lot sold at a fair price. The final gavel fell, and an approving murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. Elowen exhaled a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Serafina approached, offering a rare, small smile. "Well done." Elowen's legs wobbled beneath her. She turned to support herself against the platform's rail, every muscle aching. The auctioneer approached with the ledger and a small sack of coins. Elowen accepted them on Serafina's behalf, feeling the weight of each coin as a promise of survival. A hush fell over the crowd as the auctioneer raised his gavel once more. "That concludes our morning sale. We'll reconvene in 2 hours for the final lots, cattle from the far pasture and specialized equipment. Thank you for your patronage." Buyers dispersed, some lingering to exchange greetings or make inquiries. Elowen, her face flushed with exertion and relief, turned to Serafina. "I need a moment," Elowen said. Serafina nodded and guided her to the edge of the corral. The cool breeze brushed against Elowen's sweaty skin, carrying the scent of dust and manure. Elowen closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the ranch soothe her. The lowing of cattle, the whistles of ranch hands, and the distant caw of ravens. She took a shaky breath. Though the morning sale had gone well, the afternoon held the most valuable lot, the prized cattle from the north pastures. Their sale would secure feed and repairs for the entire winter. Serafina laid a hand on Elowen's bandaged side. "Rest here. Jed will watch you." Elowen nodded, and Serafina slipped away, disappearing into the milling crowd. Jed remained, his presence a steady beacon. Elowen sank to a bale of hay, closing her eyes. Pain radiated across her torso with each breath, but adrenaline kept her upright. Jed came to her, offering a canteen of water and a damp cloth to press to her forehead. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly. Elowen met his gaze, wincing as she shifted. "Stubborn." She managed a small, wry smile. Jed nodded, though. His eyes held worry. He knelt and helped her adjust her bandage, ensuring it remained snug. Time lengthened, and the sun climbed higher, sending long shadows across the corral. Serafina returned at midday, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" she asked. Elowen tried to lift her head. Pain ripped across her ribs, and she breathed through clenched teeth. She forced her gaze to Serafina's, seeing panic and anger mirrored there. Serafina knelt, her hand reaching for Elowen's. "Stay with me," she whispered. Elowen's vision flickered as she struggled to focus. "The herd! The herd!" she rasped. Serafina's eyes darted behind them. The cattle had passed the ravine's edge, but had halted at the crest, their lowing anxious. Ranch hands were converging, forging ropes to corral them. "Elowen, we need to get you inside," Serafina said, urgency in her voice. She bent, gathering Elowen into her arms. Elowen fought to stay conscious. The world tipped, and Serafina's face swirled, tears glinting in her eyes. "Elowen, look at me," Serafina urged. Elowen met her gaze, every heartbeat a hammer. The pain was a distant echo now, overshadowed by the roar of fear and adrenaline. "Help me," Serafina whispered. Elowen's vision darkened at the edges, but she caught Serafina's meaning. She wrapped her arms around Serafina's neck, lending what strength she could. Together they rose unsteadily, Serafina supporting the weight of Elowen's battered body as they made their way toward the barn. Elowen leaned against Serafina, every breath a knife's edge. Behind them, the ranch hands had managed to steer the herd away from the ravine. The final animals were corralled, and the men cheered, troughing at the sight. Elowen felt Serafina's arms tighten. Pain flared at the sight of the successful rescue, but a flicker of pride warmed her. They crossed the threshold of the barn. Serafina set her down gently on a bale of hay. Elowen exhaled, her chest aching. She tried to speak, but only a croak emerged. Serafina knelt beside her, brushing a damp lock of hair from Elowen's face. "You saved the herd," she said, voice trembling. "I thought we lost them all." Elowen closed her eyes, tears mingling. With the mud on her cheeks, despite the pain, she managed a faint smile. "We," she whispered, voice barely audible. "We did it." Serafina's hand covered Elowen's. A moment later, Dolan's booming voice rang through the barn's open door as he called the men to inspect the stock. The danger had passed, for now. Elowen leaned back, exhaustion flooding her senses. She realized how close they had come to losing everything. Her gaze fell on Serafina's face, the lines etched by hardship and resilience. "Elowen," Serafina said softly, "you're my family now." A warmth blossomed in Elowen's chest, eclipsing the pain. She closed her eyes, letting Serafina's words settle. The path ahead remained uncertain. Repairs to finish, the ranch to rebuild, trust to earn, but for the first time she felt the steady rhythm of home. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Night settled over Mercy Ridge like a velvet cloak. The lanterns inside the barn cast flickering halos against the hay-strewn floor. Elowen lay propped against a pile of quilts, Serafina sitting beside her with a cup of warm broth. Every sip Elowen took felt like a lifeline. Her ribs ached, but she refused to waver. Serafina watched her drink, her expression unreadable in the lantern's glow. Once Elowen finished, Serafina cleared her throat. "We have much to discuss." Elowen set the bowl aside, the steam curling around her face. "I know," she murmured, a tremor in her voice. "Are we safe?" Seraphina's eyes flicked to the barn's open doorway where Jed and the ranch hands continued to tend to the herd. For today, but these setbacks have drawn attention. Elowen frowned, the bowls of light swirling in her vision. Attention? Seraphina's lips pressed into a hard line. Word of our troubles has spread. There's talk that Mercy Ridge is ripe for takeover. Wealthy landowners from the south are sniffing around. They think we're vulnerable. A chill settled over Elowen, though the barn's warmth still pressed against her skin. Each breath stung her ribs like a brand. Seraphina knelt beside her, resting a hand on Elowen's shoulder. We need to be prepared. We'll guard the ranch, secure the herd, and ensure no one takes advantage of us. Elowen's brows knitted. Together. But we barely have enough to last the winter. She swallowed, tasting the copper tang of blood in her mouth. Seraphina's gaze hardened. We'll find a way. We've come this far. Elowen nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. She closed her eyes, letting exhaustion overtake her. As her breathing slowed, she heard Seraphina's soft hum, a lullaby in a world that had almost consumed her. Under the dim glow, Elowen drifted into slumber, each heartbeat a reminder of the fragile line they walked. Outside, a single raven cawed, its call echoing under the wide expanse of sky. Morning would bring new trials, but in that moment, Elowen allowed herself a heartbeat of peace, resting on the promise that two souls had forged a bond strong enough to withstand a forgotten town storms. Elowen Gray's first conscious thought was the tremor of panic that shot through her chest. She lay half-curled on the hay-strewn floor of the barn, the remnants of Seraphina's quilts wrapped around her tightly, the gentle hum of voices, Jed, and other ranch hands, filtered through the darkness, accompanied by the faint smell of molasses tea lingering on the stale air. The first light of dawn had not yet crept over the horizon, yet the barn's lanterns glowed as if warding off the night's chill. A dull throb pulsed behind Elowen's eyes. She blinked, focusing on the flickering lantern suspended from a beam above. Its warm glow cast moving patterns on the wooden walls. Each heartbeat echoed like distant thunder, reminding her of the broken rib's ache, the scar where the gash had closed at her temple. Miss Gray? Jed's hushed voice cut through her fog, gentle yet threaded with concern. Elowen recognized it and attempted to lift her head, only to feel a sharp, searing pain. Light-headedness followed, and she forced herself to settle back, exhaling in a soft hiss. "It's time," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. Time! Elowen's mind struggled to form meaning. Then the memory emerged. The rumors of land grabs circling Mercy Ridge, the notion that opportunistic ranchers planned to seize Seraphina's property while she was weakened by the recent storms. Elowen's lips parted, a silent question. Jed knelt beside her, his hand closing around hers. "Seraphina needs you. It's happening." Elowen forced her eyes open, the barn's shadowy interior coming into sharper view. Seraphina's horse, adorned with a fresh saddle blanket, stood tethered to a post. The mare's coat was dew-damp and matted with dried mud. Beside her, Seraphina stood, her duster pulled tight around her, eyes narrowed into dark slivers. Outside the barn, hoofbeats approached, muffled but unmistakable. Elowen sat up fully, clutching the quilt. Pain bloomed across her side, and her mouth fell open in a silent gasp. Jed rose, offering her a steadying arm. "They're here," he murmured, voice taut. Elowen's chest tightened. She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the agony radiating from her ribs. Somewhere deeper than fear, a sense of duty anchored her. Seraphina's trust in her had never wavered, not once. And Elowen couldn't allow that faith to go unrewarded. She staggered to the barn's entrance, bracing herself against the frame. Outside, the dark sky was tinged with the first grey of dawn. Two riders spurred their horses through the icy mist. A heavy-set man in a dust-caked coat, his jaw locked in determination, and beside him a wiry figure whose lean face betrayed a hint of a smirk. The heavy-set man dismounted at the barn's door. His boots crunched on the wet ground. Elkton Briggs, once a minor rancher on the edge of Mercy Ridge, stood tall, his shoulders squared. His eyes flicked to Elowen, and a cold recognition passed between them. "And here we have Elowen Gray," he said, voice carrying the crackle of accusation. He spat onto the ground. "I hear you've been meddling in Mrs. Maddox's affairs. Figured you'd be an easy mark. Don't look so surprised, girl. Word travels that Mercy Ridge is ripe for picking, and that Madam's ranch catches all the eyes of bigger players. Players like me." His gaze hardened. "Step aside." Elowen swallowed, tasting the metallic sting in her mouth. The ribs protested sharply when she inhaled. Yet she returned his stare, eyes burning with conviction. "She's not alone here," Elowen said, voice low but clear. Sparks of defiance ignited in her chest. "And even if she were, she wouldn't stand down." The wiry man, a certain Darius Pike, one of Elkton's hired guns, stepped forward, spurs jangling. "Cute," he sneered. "This white-haired bride protector thinks she can stand against Elkton Briggs? You, a woman with broken bones?" Jed appeared at Elowen's side, his presence a silent promise. Behind him, Seraphina emerged from the barn's shadow, horse bridle in one hand. Elowen took a breath, the cold air drawing tears to her eyes. She angled her body so the quilt fell away, revealing the blood-soaked bandage wrapped tight around her midsection. The pair of bolts still etched on her jaw, where the lantern had smashed. Seraphina moved to stand beside Elowen, the two paralleling one another like sentinels guarding a fortress. "You'll get no ransom from this ranch today, Briggs," Seraphina said, voice a low growl. The cold morning air made her breath visible in puffs. Elowen offered Elkton a bitter smile, despite the throb that radiated through her torso. "If you're here to take us," she said, "you'll find we're stronger than you think." Elkton's lip curled. "Your business is my business now. We'll settle accounts, not tomorrow but today." His fingers twitched near the butt of a concealed revolver. Elowen's heart hammered. Her vision narrowed to the flash of steel beneath his coat, the hateful spark in his eyes. She glanced at Seraphina, who clenched her fist, veins standing out. "Like knotted cords," Darius snorted. "Mind if I take this one?" he said, nodding at Elowen. "She looks like she's good for the bail." Elowen squared her shoulders, her palms damp. She had no weapon, only stubborn conviction and raw nerve. She thought of the calf they'd saved, the fence they'd mended, the auction that had secured the ranch's future only yesterday. She refused to let those efforts vanish. "Back away," she said. "Now." Her voice was hoarse, yet it carried the weight of steel. Elkton's eyes narrowed. He stepped forward, his boot almost touching Elowen's dirt-caked slipper. "Is that a threat, little bride?" He spat again. "Get out of my way!" Elowen's teeth ground together. A tremor rattled her frame as fear surged. She shifted her stance, planting her feet shoulder-width apart. The pain in her ribs flared, but adrenaline blunted it. "I won't let you harm a woman too weak to fight back," Elkton said, his voice low. "Seraphina Maddox is letting you hide behind her, but I see right through that." Storm clouds gathered overhead, and the wind rose as though the land itself roared its defiance. Elkton flinched at the sudden gust. Seraphina stepped forward, hand instinctively reaching for her revolver, tucked in her waistband. "Elkton, you're outnumbered," she said. "We side with Mercy Ridge. You come with your men, and you signal siege. But this ranch has more better men than you can reckon." Elkton let out a bark of laughter. "Your men cower under your skirt, Maddox. Without you, they're nothing." A faint whistle sounded from the ridge behind Elkton. A shadow emerged. Jameson Creel, the local blacksmith, leaning on a warped shovel. Another man joined, Jonas Riker, the butcher, brandishing a blood-slicked cleaver. More ranchers appeared, weathered, scarred men and women who had staked their survival on Mercy. "Ridge's promise," Elkton's smug grin faltered. Hornet calls echoed. the staccato notes of solidarity. Elowen's heart thundered as she recognized neighbor after neighbor gathering behind Serafina. Elkton's face twisted. "You'll pay for this," he spat, reaching to draw his revolver. Darius moved to steady him, but their moment of hesitation was fatal. With a roar, one of the ranchers charged, swinging a shovel. Horses reared, and the ground trembled beneath the stampede of enraged resolve. Elowen's breath caught. Beside her, Serafina drew her revolver with an expert flick. The automare cracked as each man strapped holster to thigh. The confrontation brightened. Dawn's pink light tugged at cloud cover, revealing the tableau of defiance. Darius lunged for Elowen. She staggered backward, a surge of panic cutting through her. Pain blossomed in her side with every breath. She struggled to remain steady as she lurched back. Serafina's revolver bucked in her hand as she took aim. A shot rang out, echoing across the canyon. Darius froze, eyes wide, as the bullet tore through his right shoulder, sending him howling to the ground. Elkton's rage erupted. He fired wildly, bullets tearing at the dusty earth. One round shattered the side of the barn, splintering planks where Elowen had slept. Splinters rained down, and she yelped, flinching away just as Elkton raised his revolver for another shot. Serafina pivoted, returning fire. This shot found its mark in Elkton's hat brim, sending sparks flying as the bullet zipped through. Elkton snarled, the hat thrown back, revealing a scalp flecked with sweat. Elowen stumbled back, each breath a guillotine of agony. She saw Elkton's hand steadied, finger tightening on the trigger. She knew she had only a heartbeat to act. Serafina's eyes flicked to Elowen, a fierce determination blazing, but Elkton was faster. He lunged forward, revolver outstretched, aimed at Serafina's chest. Time slowed. Elowen felt the world narrow to a pinpoint. The muzzle flash, Serafina's roar, the ricochet off the barn post. And then she caught Elkton's extended arm, as though she moved through water. Her gaze locked onto Serafina's bullet-shattered revolver barrel, hot and bright in her vision. A thunderous crack echoed. Elowen's senses reclaimed sensation in blinding spasms. The crack of Elkton's neck as his head snapped back. The warm spray of blood, the ragged sob of Darius, the heavy hooves of charging ranch hands converging around the fallen tyrant. Serafina's voice cut through the haze. "Elowen, behind me!" Elowen snapped back from Elkton's body, the force of the shot throbbing in her side. She staggered, vision flickering. Serafina grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the barn's corner as the other ranchers detained Darius, binding him hand and foot. Elowen's heart pounded, her legs trembled, and she fought to steady her breathing. Pain radiated, its edges softening as adrenaline receded. Serafina slung an arm across Elowen's shoulders, half supporting her as they moved. "You saved me," Serafina whispered. His voice choked with gratitude and fear. Elowen's nails bit into Serafina's duster. Weakness fluttered in her limbs, but she forced herself to stay upright. She glanced down at Elkton, lying still, the early dawn light revealing the glints of blood on his face. A roar rose behind her as the gathered ranchers removed the reins from Darius's horse, dragging him away. Beyond them, a lone rider turned at the edge of the ridge, galloping toward a distant horizon, disappearing like a spectre. Elowen swallowed, her sides heaving. She managed a hoarse whisper. "Is it over?" Serafina nodded, though her eyes remained on the horizon. He'll think twice before pressing his claim again. She turned, her gaze sweeping across the assembly of ranchers. "This is Mercy Ridge," she announced. "Our home, and no man will wrest it from our hands." A swell of cheers rose in the crisp air, echoing off the surrounding hills. Elowen closed her eyes, a fragile smile emerging through her haze of pain. In that moment, Elowen understood the weight of every sacrifice she had made. The calves saved, the auctions brokered, the fences mended, and the ribs shattered. All of it had led to this stand. A stand not just for Serafina, but for every soul who believed in Mercy Ridge's promise. Serafina guided Elowen to a bale of hay, helping her settle gently. The ranchers lingered, their faces solemn now, paying respect not only to the fallen Elkton, but to the woman who had faced him. As the first pink rays of sunlight kissed the ridge's edge, Elowen felt something shift deep within her, a sense of belonging deeper than any she had ever known. For the first time, her silver hair felt less like a curse and more like a banner of resilience. Serafina knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on Elowen's. Their eyes locked, and no words were needed. In that shared silence, they both understood the depth of their bond, one forged through trials more brutal than either could have foreseen. "Elowen," Serafina said, voice husky with emotion, "today you did more than save me. You saved this town, and me with it." Elowen's breath hitched. She closed her eyes, fighting back tears she refused to shed. She managed a nod. Though her body trembled, Serafina pressed her hand to Elowen's cheek, gently brushing away a fleck of mud and blood. "You are stronger than you know." The words settled over Elowen like a mantle. She exhaled a ragged breath, the pain in her ribs paling in the glow of Serafina's affirmation. A hush fell over the barn as the ranchers bowed their heads in a moment of reverent silence. Elowen felt each heartbeat echoing like distant drums, reminders of life's fragile pulse. When the hush broke, the murmur of conversation rose again, but softer now, toned with respect rather than malice. One of the ranchers, a young woman named Marlowe, stepped forward, her voice clear. "Madam Maddox, Miss Gray, I propose we dedicate this day as Day of Resilience to honor all who fight for Mercy Ridge." A chorus of agreement met the suggestion. Elowen opened her eyes, gratitude swelling in her chest. Serafina squeezed her hand. "Make it so," she said. Elowen felt tears slip down her cheeks as the ranchers began to disperse, some patting her shoulder, others offering nods of admiration. She took a moment to gather the mess of blankets and quilts around her, each piece a testament to nights spent recovering. Finally, Serafina rose, extending her hand to Elowen. "Come," she said, "we'll face the sunrise together." Elowen allowed herself to be helped to her feet, leaning heavily on Serafina. Each step toward the barn's doorway brought waves of pain, each breath a wedge of discomfort. But her heart soared as she crossed the threshold into the morning light. Outside, the world was awash in gold and rose. The hills glowed as though set ablaze. The ranchers gathered in small clusters, their faces turned to the horizon. Elowen and Serafina found a spot on a low fence rail, the two of them seated side by side. The cool morning breeze tousled Elowen's silver hair, and she closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the sun seep into her bones. She thought of her life before, the fever that had taken her parents, the boarding house in Franklin Falls, the impossibility of a future with white hair, and she marveled at how far she had come. She had come to a place that had first seen her as a lost bride, only to discover her true worth. Serafina's voice broke her reverie. "You have earned your place here, Elowen," she said, "and as of today you have a home in Mercy Ridge." Elowen opened her eyes, meeting Serafina's gaze. The rancher's blue-green eyes reflected the promise of a future where Elowen was no longer defined by her hair, but by the steel in her heart. Above them, a hawk cried, circling the vast sky. Elowen followed its flight with her gaze, imagining the freedom it embodied. "I never believed I would find a place to belong," Elowen whispered, voice catching. She allowed herself that simple admission. Serafina reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind Elowen's ear. "You found it." Elowen closed her eyes again, savoring the moment. The dawn's glow, the soft stir of wind through the pastures, the steady presence of Serafina at her side. They remained in that silent vigil, watching the sun rise higher, until the barn filled with soft footsteps, the ranchers returning to their chores. cattle lowing in the distance. The golden light lingered on the horizon long after the ranch hands had departed. Eluan allowed herself to bask in that radiance, an ember of hope that would burn through the winter's cold. As the ranch around them awakened, Serafina nudged Eluan gently. "Let's go inside. There's work to be done." Eluan nodded. She took Serafina's hand, letting her lead the way. The weight of her ribs reminded her of the battle she would continue to fight, yet she found her step steady under Serafina's guidance. Inside the barn, preparations for the day's chores began anew. Hay was stacked, horses readied, and plans made for fortifying fences against the next storm. Eluan walked beside Serafina, each breath measured. She felt the twitch of muscles begun to heal, the promise of recovery coiling like a spring inside her. Serafina paused at the ledger hanging on the barn wall. She flicked a lantern's wick to bright glow, illuminating the pages where yesterday's auctions were recorded. Eluan's gaze fell on the ledger. Numbers, expenses, auction totals, all entries that chronicled the lifeblood of Mercy Ridge. "You did all this," Eluan whispered. Serafina gave a small, proud nod. "And now we rebuild, stronger than before." Eluan pressed her bandaged, sighed, feeling a dull throb that had become a familiar companion. She met Serafina's eyes, silently promising to stand by her through the rebuilding. Serafina closed the ledger. Her expression softened as she turned to Eluan. "You're my partner now, in every way." Eluan's breath caught. She had no words to respond. Instead, she reached out, resting her hand atop Serafina's. Outside, the first cattle of the morning lowed, stirring the quiet. Eluan looked out at the pastures, where the herd grazed calmly in the early light. A single raven glided overhead, its wings spread wide against the blue sky. Eluan watched it soar, feeling the infinite possibilities stretch before her. She turned back to Serafina, determination flaring in her chest. "We face whatever comes next, together." Serafina smiled, a radiant curve of lips that banished the shadows of doubt. She squeezed Eluan's hand. Eluan Grey looked around the barn, at the steadfast walls, the stalls holding her companion, horses, the stable mice scurrying away from their footsteps, and realized there was no place she'd rather be. The dawn of that day marked not only the end of the struggle for Mercy Ridge, but the beginning of a new chapter in Eluan's life. One where she was seen not as the white-haired stranger, but as a woman of unwavering strength. And long after the final chore was done, the wind whispered through the hawthorn trees, carrying with it a single promise, that Mercy Ridge would endure, as would the bond between the woman it had saved and the woman who had become its guardian. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.